Okay, perfect. Great. So everybody, welcome. This is a really important discussion this evening, and we're delighted that you're all with us tonight to have that discussion. As I mentioned, I'm Valen Brown with the Alliant Educational Foundation, and we're really the nonprofit sort of charitable partner to Alliant International University and the California School of Professional Psychology. But as a nonprofit, we're really focused on education and mental health as our two primary areas of focus. Salons like this, essentially virtual webinars, are really important to us because they really offer an opportunity to help sort of educate, inspire, and ultimately connect our constituents, whether those be students, alumni, current faculty and staff, or friends to the foundation or to the profession of psychology. The topic tonight, which we're calling Helping Psychologists Respond to These Tumultuous Times, is incredibly timely and time sensitive. Our moderators will help frame up the topic here in just a moment this evening as well. We have a really terrific panel tonight, or this afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. We're really excited to have four individuals with us being able to share their perspectives on kind of key topics this evening, and we will introduce them in a moment. We're also going to make sure that we make time for Q&A. I think that's really important for a session like this. So we're going to try to get to several of your questions towards the end of the session today. You may note we actually have you muted because we do have a number of folks in today's webinar. So just to avoid background sounds, we're going to head and mute everybody. For panelists, you want to unmute yourselves once we get to that point, and leave yourselves unmuted as panelists so that you can chime in and share and don't have to worry about muting and unmuting. I'd strongly recommend that. For questions, we would ask that participants tonight use the chat function. So depending on what system you're using, a tablet or a phone or a computer, you should find a button at the bottom called chat. And we'll monitor that so we can pull some of those questions and bring those into the discussion towards the end of tonight's panel discussion as well. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to our co-moderators this evening, Janet Hurwicz and Connell Persico. Welcome, both of you. And Janet, over to you.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I am so pleased that you're here joining us for this panel. I'm Janet Hurwicz. As Valen just said, I graduated from CSPP in Alameda. I'm a psychologist and a businesswoman. Connell?
Hi, everybody. I'm Connell Persico. Before I retired, I was senior vice president and a university professor at Alliant International University. And I'm currently vice chair of the Alliant Educational Foundation Board. We all are aware of kind of the large scale policy changes that seem to be coming fast and furious from the White House executive orders and the impact these changes are having nationwide. Psychologists in particular have had to rise to the challenge of listening to their clients' concerns and fears while managing their own. Unlike other crises, 9/11, for example, these issues never stop, but rather they continue day after day until there are almost too many to list. And each new issue seems to have dire consequences for more and more different populations. So we have invited our panelists here to share their skills and knowledge with us. The first of several panels that we hope will provide support and community to all those who participate. Please do bear in mind that the panelists too are learning how to cope with these challenging times. Janet?
I'm really pleased and honored to be able to introduce our panelists this evening. The first is Dr. Kelly Haynes Mendez, Senior Director of the Human Rights Team, American Psychological Association. Hi, Kelly. Second is Abdi Saltani, who is the Executive Director of the ACLU Northern California. Good evening, Abdi. The third is Dr. Gracie Madero, who is the Director of Training at CSPP San Diego at Alliant International University. Hi, Gracie. And Dr. Kumeya Shorter Gooden, who is the Principal and Owner of Shorter Gooden Consulting. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us. Connell, you want to get us started?
Yes, and as I'm looking at it, you're all muted, and so please unmute because I don't want to have to answer all these questions. Okay. So let me begin with, and let me throw this first to you, Abdi. In your opinion, what policy changes that are occurring right now pose the greatest risks to psychologists and their clients?
Oh, great question. Big question. First, a thank you to all of you and everyone here, the panelists and university, the foundation, and in particular, Dr. Hurwitz, who I've known for many years and who reached out to me. Uh, Connell, the way I'm going to answer that is slightly different because I don't know that I can say what's the greatest risk. I'd like to answer two that I think are of very high risk, but not to the exclusion of many others. I think that these executive orders and the expected policies of this administration are going to come down and are already coming down really hard and heavy on two already very vulnerable communities. One, immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, but as everyone knows, most people live in mixed status households. So what's going to come down on undocumented immigrants will certainly affect people of all different statuses. And when you have like this heightened immigration enforcement, it also leads to like just more racial profiling and unlawful traffic stops by ICE and Border Patrol. Actually, just within the last 2 hours, my office filed a big lawsuit against an immigration enforcement in Kern County in Bakersfield, where, you know, these things wrap up a whole community. So immigrants, as a whole are going to be a group that's heavily impacted. I will just say, like, for those young adults who are in the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, who are wondering what will happen to those work authorizations. They've given all their information to the United States government, and that could be, you know, that program could be ended. I expect certainly like psychologists who are serving immigrants, immigrant residents are going to definitely face that. I think a second population that I'll name is transgender youth and adults and gender nonconforming people. I will say I'm the parent of a transgender daughter who's 18 years old. We live in the state of California, so we have like robust access to healthcare. I will say in the care team that she has benefited from just exceptional psychologists. So for those of you who work with transgender youth and adults, I want to just thank you for the care that you provide. Our family has benefited from that through the healthcare providers we have. We're in the state of California where our state law protections and state programs are strong, but nevertheless, like the executive orders are trying to reach from the federal government into states like California by threatening withholding federal funding. In states like Tennessee or Arkansas, where we have litigation and one pending at the US Supreme Court, those states themselves are violating those laws. So depending on where psychologists are practicing, and I'm not sure kind of like the reach of today's call and whether it's like current students or how much it's your alumni, but just do keep in mind, like in some states, you have a kind of like a stacking and a magnifying of state and federal policies, both coming down really hard on top of each other, like you would have, say, in states that are adopting anti-immigrant laws or anti-transgender laws, where it's magnified by the federal policy. And then you have states where your clients or your patients are going to be kind of in some ways protected or supported by their state law that's resisting the federal law. And still they're going to be experiencing a lot of distress as we go through all of this. Maybe just for a final quick closure, like access to healthcare itself is going to be on the line with federal budget cuts. So that's something that's more in your purview and your expertise than mine, but I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Abdi. Kamea, anything to add, or different populations that you were concerned about, or?
Certainly deportation and what Abdi spoke to is huge. Also huge, of course, loss of employment. We see now this latest letter to universities about not providing any kind of services connected to race or ethnicity or culture. So the whole issue of access to higher education and having the kind of support services that enable students from minoritized communities to thrive is much at issue. I also think that one of the things that we as psychologists need to think about are the not so visible impacts. What's going to be the impact long-term of this resurgence? It never ended, but a kind of resurgence and pulling the rug off of whiteness is better than any other race, right? Patriarchy, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, xenophobia. I mean, what we're seeing, and how does that get internalized by our communities and clients of color, LGBTQ, people who are undocumented or immigrants? And I think long-term, we need to be paying attention to that and what's going to be the impact of people's sense of self.
Thanks. Gracie, anything?
Yeah, I can speak to my specialty in private practice, which is my other position, is working with individuals around gender, sexuality, identity development. And I also identify as a lesbian. And so being in that community and serving these populations, I certainly felt it from really day one, and just the amount of distress. And I think it's interesting because part of it is similar to COVID, where we're experiencing it at the same time as our clients are. Except I think there's so many different intersections with this. And so it's hard to even try to provide, I would say, individuals with something that can feel safe at all when everything feels so unsafe. So I think I certainly feel those rights that are very affected. Then working at the university, really feeling, DEI concerns and taking away the policies and what that means for students who are working with those populations, or students who are planning to go work with certain populations, and then learning that, funding might not be available, or their identity might not also be accepted. And so I think it's so nuanced, and I think really overall just so unsettling around seeing how quickly the policies are changing, and then being unsure of, even if there is protection and there's litigation happening, really not knowing what that will do. So I think that's what I'm seeing right now.
Great. And Kelly, you want to sum this up?
Sure. I think that two additional areas that at least APA's advocacy team is also focusing on, in addition to the issues that have been described up until this point, are one, the removal of publicly accessible databases from federal websites, and the adverse impacts that's having or will have on psychology researchers. So our advocacy team is a part of a sign-on letter, trying to have a better understanding of just how that will impact psychology researchers who are employed by educational institutions and other research institutions who really rely on that sort of federal data as a part of their work. And then the other group of psychologists, I think, that are being advocated for and are at risk in many ways are psychologists who are employed by the federal government. And so that could be psychologists working at the VA, to psychologists working in other federal agencies and departments. And because psychology is so broad and far-reaching, that means a lot of us in lots of different parts of the government. And so I'd say that in addition to what we've described around, vulnerable populations and marginalized groups also being at risk about some of the more current legislative changes, those psychologists who are sort of working with federal data and employed by the federal government also have some risk attached to their positions as well.
Thanks so much. Janet?
Yeah, that's interesting, Kelly, because I heard yesterday, I was at our local campus, that a number of internships that are federally funded have been canceled for next year. And I don't want to say the number, I don't want to say who, but that's what I heard already. And that's very distressing. Abdi, I think most of the attendees are alumni so that just so that you know who you can't see them. So I don't think so. That's who we have. I'm going to ask you now what suggestions you might have for psychologists to help their clients to manage traumatic stress right now. Gracie, can we kick it off with you?
Yeah, so I think really what is the most helpful right now is trying to work on training psychologists and creating spaces to practice amongst each other around how to have a lot of these conversations. I think everyone's identities are, very layered, and so it's never going to be one size fits all. And I think there's great responsibility in being able to have conversations among colleagues as a source of support. I think in terms of resources, there's there's limited information that's out right now because of course this is, a lot of this is new, though it might have been somewhat anticipated. I think consulting with others is really beneficial. And having groups where you do align with others, but you're not necessarily just siding so far to one side, so that we can understand then how to be present for clients where these conversations are coming up. I think another piece that is really hard to hold on to, but also so important, is this idea and belief that people are generally good and are working to be good. And I think that is so easy for us to not see right now, because I think we see so much of, these things that we would say that are, bad or negative that are happening. And there's small wins that are happening that we're not seeing as much. But I think having belief still in humanity is an important piece. And having just spaces where psychologists can, share their thoughts and feelings in a place that is safe. I think that's some of the hardest parts, is that we're the people that, others are coming to, and yet we might not have processed something already, and there might be an issue that's in front of us. And so I think having those spaces, creating trainings. I know I've been training our supervisors at the school around how to have these conversations and then having them practice with each other to model. So I think modeling is important right now as a resource.
Yeah, as Connell said at the beginning, this is not like 9/11. I used to do disaster mental health response work. And, that's, something that's kind of over in a couple of weeks. And this is going on and will continue. And so we have to be ready, I think, as you said, with the community and the trainings that will continue as this evolves. Kelly, tell me what you think.
So this reminds me of a conversation I had recently with a colleague of mine, who we were having a conversation around helplessness, the differences between feeling helpless in this situation and having a sense of agency. And she was able to find a way to take the information from her late night scrolling through news articles and various websites about, just how bad things are, and take that information and share it out with others. And that provided a sense of agency rather than, or in lieu of that sense of helplessness. So I think that if we are also thinking about psychologists, at least, and working with our clients, helping individuals have a sense of agency, whether it's in a group, cohort with similar values, or other ways to sort of get out and do something, whether it's advocacy or other types of activities that provide a sense of agency within the current context.
Thank you.
Can I pick up on that a little bit on a grassroots basis in this panel?
Yeah.
So I think to what Kelly just said, that actually is a perfect kind of segue to like my ACLU perspective on this, is that that's actually what you just described as like that agency and how that's going to benefit the individual. It's also at the end of the day, the essential element of what will check these policies and affect positive change coming out of this difficult situation. So that level of like personal involvement could have those personal benefits, as you just said, and also is like the essential backstop. And that's where I revert to the First Amendment. You know, we think about the First Amendment just as free speech, but if you read the whole First Amendment, it begins with like your freedom of religion and thought, which is like your internal sense of conscious and personal beliefs. Then it moves to your freedom of speech, which is expression, press, which is like that dissemination, so other people can hear you, read what you're saying, and benefit from that perspective. And then the two closing parts of the First Amendment, the next part's my favorite, the freedom of assembly. So like being in association with other people, like we're social people, we're social animals, like we need and thrive on being in community. And then petitioning the government for redress of grievances is how we then have an effect on the government, on the issues we care about. So I just wanted to really I appreciate how like you grounded it from a psychologist perspective. But it also is the essential kind of legal response and advocacy response depends on people's participation.
Thank you. I appreciate you chiming in there. Kamea, I'm going to ask you a little extra bit of the question here. How could you visualize that psychologists might be giving out resources to clients in a way that perhaps we haven't had to do before, that we might be making suggestions based on their particular needs?
You know, I'm not sure. I think, so maybe I'll double back to that, Janet. One thing that I wanted to acknowledge, particularly for psychologists and clients in Southern California, are these recent fires. I used to live in Pasadena, I used to live in Altadena. I know lots of people, I know you all know folks who have been dealing with that along with this onslaught stemming from DC. And so that just adds another layer. I mean, sometimes I think about this in terms of how we approach trauma and counseling and therapy for trauma, and sort of 3 S's, helping people find stability, sort of bodily, physiological stability when we're hyperactivated, when we're sort of totally juiced up. It's hard to think. We're in fight, flight, freeze mode. So stability is important. Safety is important. Talking with clients about where and with whom do they feel safe. And even if it's fleeting, momentary spaces for safety, we know that's important. And obviously the therapeutic experience itself ought to be a space and a place where people feel that. And then there's also this issue of strength, which is, I think, really gets at what both Kelly and Abdi spoke to, which is what's the agency? What's the sphere of influence? What can the client do to feel empowered and to recognize that even small acts of resistance or of self-care or of pushback or of turning off the news. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we can use our agency, but I think that's another important part. So I don't know if that exactly gets at it, Janet, but that's part of what
I get the point. I had a conversation with somebody today where I made a suggestion about one small thing that he could do. And I think it's important because right now, for many of us, the big thing is missing, but the small thing is always there. And our friends and our neighbors are already doing some of these things. So I appreciate your response. I'm going to move on, but I think these questions kind of flow one into another. So, feel free to go back and say, I just thought of something. So the suggestions that you've made, are they suitable also for psychologists themselves? Or do you have a different set of suggestions and perhaps some extra resources for them in particular? Kelly, I'm going to start with you because of the APA connection.
Sure. So I work in the Public Interest Directorate, and my team is the Human Rights team. In 2021, the APA Council of Representatives passed a resolution committing APA to a 5 connections framework between psychology and human rights. And it is also relevant in connection to psychologists and human rights. And so those 5 connections include enjoyment, application, respect, advocacy, and access. And so, you know, psychologists enjoy human rights because we are humans. We can apply our psychological knowledge to the greater benefit of human rights, justice, fairness, and dignity. We can provide better access to mental health care as a sort of right to science and a right to mental health. We also respect human rights in terms of how we do our work. And then finally, that fifth connection is advocating for human rights, whether it is as an association, again, or as a group, and also as an individual. And so I share that context because part of our work at the organizational level is around that advocacy piece and helping psychologists get involved with some of those activities. So we actually have a Get Involved page that is a part of our advocacy work, and psychologists who are either members of the association and also not members of the association can stay up to date both on the current socio-political sort of landscape and also have access to resources for advocating for vulnerable and marginalized populations. And so I'm happy to share that resource in the chat for some of the attendees. And I think it is one of our greatest resources for psychologists and other professionals who are really wanting to advocate and provide support in that way.
Thank you. And I think APA has just had their lobby day, if I remember rightly, and the California Psychological Association is going to have theirs on March the 18th. I'm going with 13 students from Sacramento. Connell knows this already. So 14 students, sorry, 14. So because my theory is you can't teach advocacy, you have to do it. So a brief commercial there. Gracie, can you add some things here for psychologists?
Yes, so I would agree with what Kelly has also shared. I think it is working, you know, amongst our colleagues with, you know, what do they feel capable of, I think, of also doing in this moment. I think we want to have agency and we want to be part of advocacy. And I think there's an intersection right now of when you're immediately impacted by this, also being aware of what your ability is, and then deciding in what role could you take that would be helpful for you, acknowledging that that may look different every day. I think the advocacy resources from APA are really helpful, I think, especially around immigration and different ways to get involved, how to join different divisions. I think that is a really great resource. I think if you're a psychologist who's a supervisor, I know in San Diego, we have our San Diego Psych Association that has different advocacy groups. And I think that is a good resource too, especially when you're supervising and needing that support on both ends. And then I think being able to have, you know, spaces also where you're not necessarily just working in policy, I think is important. Being able to also prioritize, you know, having fun or other experiences. I think it's really easy to hone in on right now what is happening and to feel the immense weight of it. And I think just like we would want to work with, you know, clients or students, trying to bring in duality of what can happen right now still, while acknowledging that I think a lot of us feel like we want to take action. And so being able to honor that, as well as, you know, the underlying fears that I think are there a lot. We think about anxiety and action. And so being able to understand that and share that commonality with each other.
Thank you, Gracie. Kamea?
Yeah, I read something from a Reverend Marianne McKibben recently, where she framed self-care a little bit differently than I'd heard, in a way that I thought was memorable. Clearly, psychologists, just like our clients, we need to take care of ourselves. She talks about 3 areas: beauty, finding ways in the midst of the tumult to cultivate an appreciation of beauty. It might be going for a walk in the park. It might be reading a novel. It might be crafting. It might be dancing. She talks about relationships. We know how important that is. Social support. One of my mantras recently is in community. All this crap is happening, but let's stay in community. And she talks about action, which a number of us have talked about, finding something we can do. So beauty, relationships, action. She says it could be put your bra on, or someone else said it could be go to the bar. But that all of those are important to sustain ourselves, and those are important for clients as well as we navigate through these difficult times.
Yeah, that's very nice. Thank you. Abdi, the ACLU to me is the place where we can have some action. And I have very, very fond memories of a piece of work that you and I did together many years ago that I have never forgotten. And so is there something that you could say about the ACLU and how that might be somewhere where psychologists could do something different outside of the profession, perhaps?
Oh, great question, Janet. I always know it'll be a great question from Dr. Hurwitz. So a couple thoughts is, one is like when people think of the ACLU, you often think about the lawsuit. And in the lawsuit, there's an attorney who will, bring the case, but behind that person, there's the paralegal, an investigator, an office manager, someone who processes payroll, like all the things that make any organization work. More importantly, there's a client. It's a person who's affected by the problem, who also takes a great deal of courage to, raise your hand and put yourself like in the public eye and like bare your soul of like the experience that caused the grievance in the first place. So the client is huge. And they're like the protagonist, even though the lawyer, is often the person who some people focus on. But I think to the question about psychologists, like, I will just share a couple of thoughts. Like one is, please consider joining a nonprofit board. I think that board service is a really important role, and in every town and community, there's small nonprofit, mid-sized nonprofit, community-based organizations, and like the professional skills and like the human relations insights, the resources you have access to, if you're on a board, I think could be incredibly, incredibly beneficial to those communities. You're not going to be the psychologist of the board. Like you're going to have your professional boundaries of like, when is it that you're entering into, I don't know what term you use, patient or client relationship, compared to when is it you're a person who's bringing your professional knowledge to the space. I always really encourage board service. And don't hesitate to reach out to a community organization and say, hey, if I can serve on a board or a committee or something, please let me know. I think a second thing is just to the point that I think, Kelly, you spoke to in terms of access. There's some level of access to psychological healthcare through insurance, or there might be some through clinics. But as I gather, like it takes a lot of resources and many people don't have access. So I don't know to what extent this is done in your profession, but like having some pro bono clients, like or low bono. I don't know if you use that term, but we use that in the legal services field, where you charge like a reduced rate for people for whom the normal rate is just beyond their means. I serve on a board of a group called Immigrants Rising, which is a group focused on undocumented immigrant youth and young adults. They have a mental health program that's emerged because we saw like immigrant youth. Initially, we provide a lot of education about education and careers, but we saw that they need a lot of support around mental health. So we're doing a lot of programming in that organization in like group settings, which is not like individualized care. But at any rate, my point being, to the extent that you can make parts of your practice more accessible to people who otherwise don't have the means to pay for it, through whatever the right route is for you and your practice, I think that would be another suggestion that I would have.
Thank you, Abdi. I just wanted to say that what you said just reminded me that Valen told me that I was supposed to say that I am a board member on the Aligned Education Foundation board, but I'm currently on sabbatical. I've done my 6 years, so I need a year off. So I'm sorry I didn't do that commercial announcement, but I think that what you said is true. Sometimes I think psychologists need a break from the clinical work. So volunteering for something like ACLU or something that's a non-psychology based thing might be refreshing and stimulating. So I appreciate that you made those suggestions. Thank you. Connell.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the clock and I see it's coming up on 4:40, and I want to make sure we leave time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to kind of move our agenda ahead and get to what I hope is, I wouldn't say more positive because everything I've heard is positive, but are there other suggestions, resources, words of hope that you all want to share with the audience? And before I ask you, I'm going to claim the privilege of being a moderator who's 81 years old. And so I remember a period of time in America, which was called the Red Scare, where federal workers were being removed. What then it was, instead of DEI, it was un-Americanism. So I was blessed to have parents who would take me to the rallies when I was 8 and 9 years old. I was blessed to be able to go to the UAC meetings in San Francisco and get washed down the stairs, but it brought an end to that organization. So I really want to be clear. This is not the first time. This will not be, dreadfully, it will not be the last time. But what has to happen is collective action, thought, agency, self-care, relationships, all those have to be, we have to focus on developing those aspects that are the solution to the fear and hatred that's being generated. So we have to become in relation, opposite of fear for me is risk taking. So that's my sense of, I'm hopeful because I'm seeing all of us, I'm seeing 150 people on this call rather than 15. So let me, that's my 2 cents. I'm glad I got it in. Uh, let me start with you, Kamea.
Well, I'm not quite as old as you, Connell,
Yeah.
but I'm getting up there, and I'm old enough to have lived through the 60s and for that to have had a huge impact on my life, my identity. And so I do think there's something about having that long view, which younger people maybe have to work a bit harder to have, this sort of longer view that we have been through a lot. People from minoritized identities in this nation and across the world have been through a lot. You know, water, fire hoses and dogs and segregation forever slogans. And so while what we're in now is horrific, we have found ways in even more challenging times with fewer opportunities, where you wouldn't have seen people of color or people from minoritized calls saying, "Hey, I'm a psychologist." That wasn't even a thing. So I think that connects to spirituality. That if you have access to spiritual resources, if you're religious, if your clients do, this is a time to cultivate that, to really invest in that, because it's a time that tells us that we need to look beyond our immediate circumstance and be reminded of our grand purpose or reason for being and our collective purpose. So I think those are things that help me to stay afloat. And King's famous saying, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." I'm like, I hope so, Dr. King. I hope so. You know.
It's not a smooth bend, but it's a bend.
No.
So, Kelly, hope?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously inspiring to be a part of the conversation and to hear what you and Dr. Shorter Gooden are saying. I am reminded from, again, the human rights perspective that there are, you know, the rights holders who are the people who have access to their rights. But then we also think about our heroes who are our human rights defenders, people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mother Teresa and, you know, so Nelson Mandela and so many other people throughout history who committed to envisioning with hope and helping vulnerable and other marginalized groups to really have access to the human rights that they are born with. And so I would stretch a bit and say that as psychologists, as professionals, as anyone engaged in any sort of grassroots or other types of advocacy, we can also sort of take the charge to be human rights defenders and be a part of that larger movement for justice, human rights, fairness, and dignity, which is a global movement also. And I would just say to keep going to anyone listening, because your actions, your voice will truly make a difference.
Gracie?
Yeah, I think kind of piggybacking off of what Kelly said, I think, you know, and what it has been said, that this idea that where we are now, we have not always been. And I think about all of us on this panel who hold different identities, and we wouldn't have even had these opportunities, you know, back in history decades ago. And so to think about that piece, the fact, I think, you know, when I have one of my trans clients sitting across from me, that they can even access services. And so I think on our end, part of what Abdi was saying, you know, being accessible, creating that and using that to hold hope that, you know, we on our side, we can offer more support. We can, you know, offer that option for resources for those who don't have it. And just remembering that, you know, history, it does change over time. I think another thing that's really kind of inspiring, and this is just one small example, but I know in San Diego, USD just started their first cohort of a restorative justice, a master's in restorative justice. And so I think about things like that those programs are developing, that there are people who are going to be on the ground in other countries who are going to be doing this work. And though there are challenges, there are a lot of people who want to work towards what our rights are and what we feel people deserve. I think really finding something right now that we can connect ourselves to, connecting to community. And if we don't see that community represented, then creating something like that. And knowing that there are other people who are going to be like-minded. We have everybody on this panel right now. And again, I feel similar to Kelly, it's an honor to even be able to have this conversation, to be invited to it. And so, though there's a lot of things that, you know, are really challenging, there can be a lot of beauty through action, through community, through those relationships.
Gracie, I really appreciate that. I think if I ever had the sense or the idea to write a biography or a memoir, as a gay man, I would entitle it From the Alleyways and the Bathrooms to the Boardrooms, as kind of the arc of what was available and what was possible in my life. So I really do. And I think it's critical. There are more of us than there ever were in positions to cause things to be different. So that is where my hope lies, and the belief that we're correct, that that people are better than what we are experiencing and seeing happen in leadership. But I'll editorialize for days, and I don't want to do that. Let me let you conclude this part of it, and then we'll go to questions.
I think we've gotten a great set of answers about hope, and I think we should go to the questions from the group.
All right.
All right.
Valen, I'll turn it back to you.
You got it. All right, I'm going to bring myself on the screen here for a moment. We've got 3 questions that have come in so far, and the first that I would like to tackle with the group, it's there's some nuance here. So it really has to do with dealing with sort of a unique set of clients and also being true to one's own values and morals. But I'm going to read it verbatim because I think it gives you the nuance that I think is probably most important here. Okay. As a therapist and soon to be clinical supervisor, seeking strategies for working with clients who express blatantly racist, white supremacist, or aggressively ignorant views, particularly those who weaponize terms like DEI and progressive as attacks. This goes beyond differences of opinion. It's hostile and invalidating. However, my employer has made it clear that I cannot decline clients based on political views, but these views deny my very existence and well-being. If I am not supported in referring these clients out, how can I navigate these situations while maintaining ethical boundaries, protecting my own mental health, and modeling appropriate practices for future clinicians?
I'll just say like, whoa, that's all. I'm gonna let the psychologist answer that one.
I think that's I mean, very nuanced question, and I think something that a lot of us have dealt with in terms of having clients who have, you know, very different views than we do. I think, you know, I always think about do no harm, right? As a psychologist, that is our ethical duty. And I think there is a level of, if you can work with the client and be curious about their beliefs and use that as the framework just for understanding in ways that that impacts other areas of their lives and relationships and even the therapeutic relationship. And at the same time, I think it is important in our duty to know what our limitations are, to know if we are going to be greatly influenced by a view. If I'm sitting across from a client who is, you know, bashing queer identities and they're, you know, just blatantly disrespectful, you know, I can hold that line. But if afterwards I feel like, you know, I am only going to see them in that way, it's not going to be beneficial for either. So I do think there is a duty that we have to understand our own limitations, but not just to transfer clients, to try our best to work with them through consultation and supervision. But I think when there is that higher level that's saying, no, you just need to work with them, at some point, we could be causing a lot more harm than good. So I don't know that that's a solution, but I think that's what I think about of, you know, I would have a very hard time working in that if it was, you have to work with everybody no matter what. So I'm curious what others think about that.
I really appreciate your comments, Gracie. I totally agree. I mean, part of my reaction is, oh, what better person for that problematic, discriminatory, biased client to work with than someone who gets it. You know, I really wouldn't want them to work with someone who agrees with them, right? And because we also know that some of these problematic views around sex, around gender and race and sexuality are tied to childhood traumas and problematic family histories. And so they're not, I mean, sure, we get them, we're socialized into them, and they're often tied to particular dynamics. And so I totally agree with you, Gracie. I think where we can work with such a person and not, and be able to get the kind of sustenance that we need as therapists and support, that may be a good thing. If it's too traumatizing for us as therapists, we need to not do it. I'm reminded of a book that's on my shelf. I haven't yet cracked it open. Loretta Ross, you all may know her, a Black reproductive rights activist who's just written a book called Calling In. The title is something like How to Call In When You Want to Cancel. And so it's not about therapy, but it's about this whole conundrum, which can also happen colleague to colleague or peer to peer around, do I engage with someone who has different views, or do I call them out, put them down, push them away? And how do we sort of manage that boundary? Important question.
One quick thing I would add, and you know, I'm not an attorney myself, but I work with a lot of attorneys. And so there's a couple corollaries to me. Like one is the public defenders who represent all kinds of people. Like you take the client as they are and you do your best for your ethical duty that you have. It's a really interesting profession and I think has the similar kind of toll that it takes. And then sometimes in our ACLU cases, we represent, you know, pretty reprehensible people who say or do reprehensible things, but we still believe that they have the right to counsel. The psychologist relationship is so intimate and it gets so personal that I those corollaries don't necessarily match, but I think today, like just also looking at this comment that's in the chat just right now, is you all have to take care of yourselves while you're taking care of your clients. So whatever you need to do at that level, please do it. Take care of yourselves while you take care of other people.
Mhm.
Okay, so maybe we use that as a springboard because we, not everybody's going to monitor the chat field here, but the gist of the question that Abdi was just alluding to is essentially getting some tips on how not to burn out under everything that's sort of happening right now. The idea that the toll on psychologists is significant. And the question really is, how do you continue to cope? And how long are you an effective resource for your clients in so doing? Tips on avoiding burnout and coping given the circumstances. Now, we talked about stress a little bit earlier, and probably some of those are relevant, but does this bring any other thoughts to mind?
So one quick thought is we've talked a lot about action and how that can be empowering. I think it's really important to know that we don't have to act.
Oh,
I
could
think
I
it's good-
get
it's
two
good.
slices of pepperoni mushroom? Yes.
Sorry, we have to do a little muting here real quick.
Yeah. So I think that's really important. We have agency around choosing when and whether we act. And I think that's one way to not burn out. Audre Lorde once said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So while action we know is important, we've got to act on our own behalves and protect ourselves as needed. And that can mean, I think a lot of us have been wrestling, for example, in the past month with when do I tune into social media? When do I turn on the news? When do I not? Yeah, I want to know. I don't want head in the sand, but I can't take it. Those are important decisions. We've got to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it takes a certain level of, your own awareness around what your limitations are and when you surpass that threshold. I think what we said in coping with stress, I think same thing, having a community to turn to. I think like Kelly said, deciding if and when you are ready to have a sense of agency. And maybe that looks like resting one day. Maybe that looks like connecting with friends, but maybe that looks like, joining a nonprofit or going and volunteering, right? And I think having the compassion and flexibility with yourself that you may not always be able to do all of those things, and not then also, like we talked to our clients, not bullying yourself when you can't do that, because then we're just working harder against ourselves. So I think there's an awareness piece, connecting with others, and also just letting it be okay that you may not be okay. I think, checking in with other professionals if you are unsure about whether or not you're burnt out, that's also incredibly important.
I'd like to add just to this part of the conversation, getting our own therapy, I think is really important. I love what Dr. Gooden was saying earlier about leaning into beauty. I'm in Texas. I'm originally from Texas, and being outside in nature always does some grounding for me. I also have a 9-year-old who's really into screens, and they have a saying, I've been on the screen so long, I just need to go outside and touch grass. And so sometimes I do that to really connect with nature and sort of have that grounding sense. And I'm also leaning into the rest is resistance movement, and really sort of shutting off screens, not reading the news, if I'm not in a sort of psychological and emotional space to do that. And so I think reiterating what everyone else is saying, that finding the right types of self-care and self-preservation is extremely important in the current context.
And I would add probably a strange thing, but I rely on a close set of friends where I can explode because there are times where I just have to damn explode because it's unbearable what goes on. So it's really know your relationships, know who you can trust and be with them and blow off the steam that accumulates.
And I'm just going to add to that. I like that idea of, I was just having this conversation with a colleague of having a couple identified people that you can do that with. And not that necessarily need to be psychologists. I think that can be helpful, but having someone who is not related. And I think having the containment of all those feelings and having that space is so important, because I think what we're seeing reflected in our world is there's no containment. And so being able to have that for ourselves, model that for our clients, friends and family, I think that part is really important.
So here's what I'm going to recommend. We do have more questions, but we also did bill this as a 1-hour session. Now, we did that ambitiously. My point being, we knew that this topic is way beyond really what 60 minutes can contain, and will continue to evolve given the nature of what's happening around us. What I will say is a couple things. Number one, there are a couple of other questions that have come in, and they're good ones, but we would have to stretch beyond the 1 hour to be able to do that. And we know that we've got people that have some hard deadlines at 5 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. But it's also why we're thinking about this as the beginning of a series. Our thought on this is that the topics here really go beyond, and of course the challenges are also evolving as new executive orders and changes in policy continue to evolve and come out, some being rejected, some being approved, and all of these things sort of moving forward. So our vision around this was always that this would be part one, and that we would be looking at having additional sessions coming up, ideally the first of which would probably be in early April. We need a couple of weeks to be able to take some of the feedback that we have here, as well as feedback from all of you. And I do want to share this. Within the next day or two, everybody on this call is going to be getting a survey, essentially asking 4 or 5 questions around the session, the topics, the needs you have for future topics, as well as presenters, and a replay of this video so that you can actually watch and share with others that weren't able to be here today. We think that's really important as far as next steps go. So with that said, I want to take a moment first to thank the panelists today, Kelly, Kumea, Gracie, Abdi. Guys, fantastic insights. Again, we could go a lot longer on these topics, and quite honestly, we need to. And secondly, I want to thank Janet and Connell as our co-moderators, and being able to help sort of elicit feedback and wisdom from each of you in a session like this is really, really important. So those are my last couple of comments. Let me kick it back to Janet and Connell if you have any closing comments as well.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being a part of what hopefully can become a community that aids and supports each other to get through this. So glad to meet all of you, even though I can't see your faces.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just watching some of the chat coming up. I didn't dare touch anything in case I did something wrong, and it's really very heartening that we've touched something, and that's important, because that's part of what's important to us as building community. Thank you all, the panelists. You were all wonderful, and it was so great to learn and to feel connected, and actually to relax while I was listening and let some of it in so that I could pay attention to what I can do. That, you know, maybe it is just touch the grass today. A couple of my friends that I go to when I have to explode are actually on the call. They're not psychologists, but they came because they wanted to hear. So thanks to them. And thanks to our audience, to Valen for putting this together for us. And we hope that you will come back, all of you.
All right, everybody, have a great evening. And panelists, again, thank you so much. We will be in touch, everyone. Have a good night.
Well, thank you all.